Hello friends and allies, and welcome to today's video. I would like to talk about the balancing project changes and how Cipsoft is focusing on the ferumbras bosses and how I believe they have a flaw in logic when it comes to making these bosses more favorable in relations to other rather newer bosses. And before I forget, I also need to say hello to Cipsoft and great you guys for changing something with the houses after I made a video on it. Before we start talking about the ferumbras bosses, I want to talk about bosses in general and how I view bosses. In my mind, we have two types of bosses which I want to be going. Or let's go for three options actually. Okay, so we have the first option, which is high reward bosses, but you have a low chance of getting anything. The high reward bosses can be bosses like Oberon, for instance, where you have a chance to be getting something highly valuable, but you won't be getting anything else, and it's a low chance of getting anything. The second kind of bosses is bosses like Dream Court, Silver Token bosses, and Gold Tokens bosses, like, Grave, Danger, and Otherworld bosses. There we have the opportunity to be gaining a high sustainability of profit. We guys know that we'll be getting tokens. The third options when it comes to bosses is the useless bosses, which you just simply are going to be going for bestiary, and no other reason than that. So, in my mind, which kind of category does the ferumbras Ascension bosses belongs in? Well, some bosses belongs in the shit category, which you only go for bestiary, and some bosses actually go into the high reward, low chance. But none of the bosses go into the category of good continuity of profit. And that is one of my issues. So, when Cipsoft is making the balancing project and focusing on experience, they are not influencing these bosses to be changing between these three categories. And these three categories are just made up by my point of mind. There are no category where you go for bosses because of experience. Like the core reason is not experience. It might be a good way if you are just making bestiary, but you consider going those bosses because of the bestiary, and the experience is simply a nice addition. If Cipsoft want to make these bosses attractive, I believe they need to be changing the loot. There are no other option when it comes to influencing players to be making these bosses. And these bosses are already kind of high punishment in damage. You also lose a lot of stamina by going these bosses because the monsters are giving experience. For example, here in Masuran, I lost 7 minutes of stamina in relation to the Grave Danger, where I can be losing 0 for some of the bosses. And the reward there is also constant, which I prefer when I make bosses. To make these bosses attractive and to actually be calling it a balancing, you need to increase the loot to today's standards to make them relevant, the Ascension bosses, because they are not relevant unless you touch the loot. And you also need to be removing the experience from the minions or monsters at least, because it removes way too much stamina. And if you're thinking about making more changes to the experience, don't. If you want to reduce the cooldown, it won't really influence my perspective on how often I will be going these bosses. Because in my perspective, pretty much all the ferumbras bosses belongs to the shit bosses, which I only make for bestiary. And that is just fine. But when you are making balancing project changes, I believe that you need to be changing the core of the bosses and not making them from irrelevant too irrelevant. You need to make them to today's standards if you're gonna touch them. Anyways, thank you guys very much for watching, and if you agree or disagree, please comment down below, and I hope we can have a good conversation. Thanks for watching, and I hope Cipsoft can be changing to a better future.